Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Lower DuPage Watershed Coalition meeting. I think we just a few other folks admitted here, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our meeting. It's a beautiful sunny May day out there. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda, kind of touching on some of our ongoing work, as well as some things that we'll be getting out to members over the next week or so. So I think the thing we're going to start out with is approving our minutes, and then we're going to get into the presentation from Tetra Tech on the Qual 2K model. So if there are any questions about the March 18th meeting minutes, otherwise if I can get a motion to approve the minutes, raise of hand. There we go. I got Amy, the motion to approve the minutes, and can I get a second? And I got Scott Killinger. All right, let me launch the poll. You can click your answer and hit submit. Okay, thank you very much. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and jump right into our presentation from Tetra Tech. We have Hillary Yance, who's going to, as soon as I finish here, she'll share her screen and jump into the presentation. And we also have Jennifer Olson from Tetra Tech on the call as well. But I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Hillary.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Great. So yes, hello all. My name is Hillary Yance, and I'm a professional hydrologist and environmental scientist with Tetra Tech. And I'm performing the bulk of the Qual 2KW modeling for this project, along with my colleague, Michelle Schmidt, who's also on this call, and so is John Butcher, who's providing technical oversight for us, and also guidance from Jennifer Olson, who's here as well. So first, I'd like to thank you all for having us today, and a big thank you for the coordination and direction that we've received from both Dina and Stephen on this project as well. So happy to share with you the status of the Qual 2KW receiving water model that we are building for the lower DuPage River. I'll be walking through some of the model setup process, what data we're using, how the model calibration is going to be completed, and some of our next steps. So as you all know, there are a large number of impaired waterways in both the DuPage and Salt watersheds, including the main stems of the lower East Branch, West Branch, and Salt, impaired for a number of different parameters. So this modeling effort is focused on dissolved oxygen as it is connected to water quality standards for the support of aquatic life in these rivers. So we know that low DO is a problem in these waterways, and past research such as the biological assessments and feasibility studies have indicated that the likely sources contributing to poor water quality in these rivers are stormwater runoff, hydro modifications like dams and extreme channelization in areas, as well as permitted point sources, those wastewater discharges that are located throughout these urban watersheds. So water quality impairments have persisted for quite some time, but still a lot has been done and is continuing to be done, as you all know, to help improve that water quality in both the DuPage and Salt watersheds. So that's the context for this project, which I'm sure you all are comfortable with and familiar with. So this modeling effort was established in hopes to leverage as much of the kind of vast existing data set as possible. The existing models were built in the Qual2K platform, and those were for the East Branch and Salt Creek. There was also a small one for the upper portion of the lower DuPage, as I'm sure you know. But those Qual2K models represented a single critical day. So these prior models were not calibrated for nutrients. They didn't look at, larger swaths of time. They were focused on that single critical hot day simulation. And so since those prior modeling efforts were conducted back in 2004, 2010, there have been a number of implementation improvement projects that have occurred, like the removal of dams, for example. So the scope of this project was to create separate Qual2KW models for the main stem of each of these major waterways: Salt, East Branch, West Branch, and Lower DuPage. So the most recent Qual2K model for Lower DuPage, which was for the upper segment GB16, that was only the upstream end. And as for typical application, it was the simulation date for that model was August 1st, 2006. And we were just looking at DO concentrations in response to extreme conditions. Qual2KW, which we're applying for all of these watersheds now, is capable of simulating an entire calendar year with hourly data inputs. So we're able to directly leverage much more of the existing field data than any previous modeling effort. And we're simulating that diel 24-hour daily cycle of both temperature and dissolved oxygen as it changes due to photosynthesis and respiration. So as Dina has spoken about previously with you all, I believe the point of this modeling effort is to support the special condition to identify potential measures to improve DO in these waterways. So specifically our Lower DuPage River. So for context, we've already completed model calibration for the East Branch model, and the West Branch model is now a work in progress. So that's part of the reason why what you're seeing today is a snapshot in time of where the Lower DuPage River model is, because we can't complete the Lower DuPage model until the West Branch is done. So we're about halfway there, maybe you could say, but we're waiting on the West Branch to be completed, which is not far off in time. But so the Lower DuPage model is being simulated for calendar year 2018, because that's the most recent intensive monitoring data. And that's used to both parameterize model inputs, as well as that data is also used for model calibration. So this map shows, just the direct drainage area to the Lower DuPage downstream of the confluence of the East and West branches. So note that due to the several year cycle of intensive sampling, the simulation years for the other waterways are different than the simulation for Lower DuPage. The East Branch was built for 2019. The West Branch is being built on 2020 data, just sampled last year. And the Salt Creek model, which is also nearing completion for calibration purposes, is modeled for calendar year 2016. So the Qual2K model requires that the Lower DuPage River be segmented into model reaches, which each represent hydraulically similar, well-mixed segments. And we generally create segmentation based on locations of tributaries, dams, point source discharges, extensive Illinois reach segments. And in total for this model, there were 21 model reaches, typically shorter than about 4 kilometers. The shortest reaches, which are 0.1 kilometers, that's the shortest segment you can get, are used to represent the dam, for example, the Hamel-Woods Dam. So since we're only modeling the main stem, each tributary is simulated as a boundary condition flowing into the main stem at discrete locations with specifically parameterized flow and water quality. So major tributaries, we've got, Springbrook, Lily Cache, and Rock Run, I&M Canal down at the southern end. And then, of course, the downstream extent of the model is at the Channahon Dam prior to that confluence with the Des Plaines. And we are discretely simulating the Hamel-Woods dam, which is present based on the 2018 simulation year. So once we've defined our model segments, building the rest of the Qual2KW model involves inputs for hydraulics, meteorological forcing, boundary conditions, inflows at headwaters, tributaries, runoff, permitted point sources. So for hydraulic development, we were able to leverage the existing HECRAS model that was developed for Will County by the Army Corps of Engineers. This event-based hydraulic model was used to inform the channel representation in Qual2KW. And although the way that channels are simulated in the two models does vary a bit, much finer resolution available with something like HECRAS, we were able to use those existing cross sections as a jumping off point. And we were able to refine these inputs as well by calibrating the model to observed velocity, flow, and depth measurements, velocity, width, and depth measurements associated with the USGS flow gauges that are on the lower DuPage. And so as I mentioned, this is a continuous simulation of calendar year 2018. So unlike a single day critical condition model, we need an hourly input time series for air temperature, dew point temperature, wind speed, cloud cover, solar radiation. So these inputs were developed using gridded national data sets. And lastly, the stream shading, that was assumed to be negligible for all of these models actually, due to, so what shade is simulating is the shade from topography and riparian vegetation along the stream center line. So we would anticipate that to be relatively negligible for rivers and streams of this width, as well as in this part of the country. So those are our meteorological forcing. Next, boundary inflows like headwaters, tributaries, diffuse sources like groundwater and surface water runoff. Boundary flows were derived using a water balance method, given what we know from observed flows at USGS stations and known flows from permitted point sources. So that's how we got to the flows that are associated with, that flow into each of those model segments, whether or not that's from a tributary, groundwater, etc. The water quality associated with those flows were parameterized based on observed data on tributaries over the past 2 decades. So we had a wealth of data that we could pull from, but of course, most of that water quality data from tributaries was from 2012, 2015, 2018. So one of the largest holes in the lower DuPage Qual2KW model right now is that the headwaters, which is about 50% from East Branch, 50% from West Branch, we have the output of the East Branch Qual2KW model feeding into the headwaters of the lower DuPage, and the West Branch is not complete. So right now, the headwaters are simulated as exclusively coming from East Branch. So that's just kind of a placeholder so we can see how things are looking already. However, this is just a preliminary calibration, so keep that in mind. And so also, so I said that we're using the tributary sampling to parameterize the tributaries and kind of diffuse inflow to the main stem, but we're not yet using, in what I've discussed here, any of the main stem sampling to develop the model. The main stem sampling is reserved for model calibration, so we can make sure that we're representing the system as accurately as possible. So last but not least, model parameterization required boundary conditions associated with permitted point sources that discharge to the main stem. So using the 2018 DMR data, model inputs were developed for each of these 6 wastewater facilities on the main stem for explicit inclusion in the model. So the 2018 simulation includes existing facilities at known flows with largely known water quality inputs. So next I'll show you what the Qual2KW model output looks like and how calibration is being conducted. Remember, this is preliminary. So looking at our model segmentation there, the primary calibration sites are listed there by model reach. So for flow, we have 2 locations that we can calibrate for hydrology in general based on the locations of the 2 USGS stations. For temperature and dissolved oxygen, we can calibrate, we're focusing on 4 different locations where there was long-term sonde deployment in 2018, and calibrating nutrients at 4 different locations as well. It could be done at a number of different locations, but we're focusing now on 4 that have the most available grab sample data from 2018. So now I'm going to show you what the calibration looks like now, looking at model reaches 16 and 17, which are downstream of the Hamel Woods Dam. So the model was not exactly calibrated for flow because flow was an input to the model based on USGS gauges. So what you see here is the blue line is the simulated flow, the orange dots are the observed flow. So we would expect this to be a very good match, which we do see, which means that the model is performing as we expected. Our inputs make sense for hydrology. So that's great to see. And this is just sort of like a dummy check, if you will. And also this is very close to that USGS gauge, so we expect it to be a really great match. But what we can then do is look at the parameters of velocity and width to make sure that our channel geometry are appropriate. So here we're looking at reach 16. We see that the stream velocity during 2018 is well captured by the hydraulic inputs. I would also like to note that these crazy colors, the kind of blue and green and yellow, these are the native output graphics from Qual2KW. I'm not crazy about them, but that is how they come out of the model. So bear with the visuals. I did not make these color choices. So next, looking at channel width, we see that the simulated width matches reasonably well with the observed width. There is an exception there in September of 2018. That may actually be an inaccurate width measurement because that flow event was reasonably large. So I don't think that that width is accurate, but we see a generally good representation of those observed widths. Similarly with depth as well at this location. So, with the model, we can look at any location, any reach along the entire model extent. So we're zooming into this one location and looking at the entire year. And depth is not actually a measured field parameter from USGS, but they do measure channel area and width. So we just approximated depth from those parameters. So now let's look at something a bit more interesting. We can look at water temperature. So hopefully this isn't too difficult to see, but the orange dots again are the observed water temperature at reach 17. We see that the sonde was deployed from about early July through mid-August from the orange dots, and the simulated temperature is the blue line. We see that it matches quite well during the time that we have observed data. So we don't have winter water temperature data at the site to compare to, but we can at least tell that where we do have data, we're seeing a reasonably good match. And that's even without the West Branch headwater water quality being parameterized. And so we always would want to make sure that we feel confident with the way the temperature is looking and the way the hydraulics are looking before we would look at nutrients and dissolved oxygen, for example. So remember that everything after this point is a bit more to be taken with a grain of salt as a work in progress. So here this is looking at the nutrient calibration for nitrogen. So the species that we have observed in the watershed for nitrogen are both ammonia and nitrite. And we see that we're capturing the right order of magnitude for both of these parameters, but the calibration is pending completion of that West Branch. Similarly for phosphorus, the model does include speciation of phosphorus, but we have observations that are most appropriate to compare with total phosphorus. So looking here, observations to simulation, we're seeing that we're in the right order of magnitude, but calibration needs to continue. There's also a little bit of chlorophyll A data at this location. There's just 3 observations during this summer, and we can tell that the model is under predicting chlorophyll A in those locations. So during the summer, we will definitely be zeroing in on trying to capture those observations, but also recognizing that they may not be representative of long-term trends because only 3 samples, we also have to take that with a grain of salt. And related for the lower East Branch, that should just say lower DuPage River. There's also no particular data for bottom algae, but bottom algae is part of the biological condition in the stream, which is responsible for the diel cycle in DO. So this is something that we will look at and try to calibrate based on the results that we see from the other reaches in the area as well, but we don't have direct data to compare. And here's an example of the kind of snapshot in time prior to extensive calibration of dissolved oxygen. So the blue line is the diel cycle, the daily min and max of dissolved oxygen simulated by the model over time. The pink is dissolved oxygen saturation, and the orange is the observations from 2018 during that same time period of sonde deployment that we saw for temperature. So we can tell that, from the observations that we're seeing, super saturation, DOs up in the, 17s, 18s, 19s, 20s a little bit. So the model is not capturing that extreme super saturation yet, but that will be the goal during calibration. So then I guess the next thing that I'd like to talk about is just what our next steps are moving forward. So we need to complete model calibration once the West Branch is complete shortly here. Then we will be completing sensitivity analyses. So we'll be modifying key parameters, a suite of key parameters, such as dissolved oxygen at the boundaries, sediment oxygen demand in stream. We'll be tweaking these parameters for, we typically do up and down like 25% to produce this kind of a graphic that you see on the slide here. This is called a tornado diagram. So that allows us to see how sensitive the model is relative to each of these parameters, kind of relative to each other. So model sensitivity, you could look at a model and say, well, how sensitive is the flow in the model to changing certain parameters? What we're looking at is how sensitive is the summertime minimum DO sensitive to these changes in parameters. So this is just an example of a tornado plot there that we will be producing for the lower DuPage. And of course, relative sensitivity may change depending on where you are in the system. So whether or not we look at the sensitivity at the downstream end versus maybe halfway up the river is going to be interesting to potentially explore as well. And then once the model is calibrated and sensitivity analyses are conducted, we will then run model scenarios to consider the various types of conditions that you all are interested in seeing, whether it's removal of a dam, increasing or decreasing in-stream phosphorus, potentially from point sources. We can run scenarios of all types across the watershed to improve DO either system-wide, or we could target specific locations. That's sort of a work in progress with Dina and Stephen prior to this point. We've been looking and talking about the scenarios for the East Branch, starting to talk about the salt. And so now we're also starting that conversation with you all potentially as well for the lower DuPage. Yeah, so that's kind of where things stand. Calibration continues. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody may have, or yeah, that's what I had prepared. So I guess I'll leave the slides up in case anybody has any slide specific questions.
Great, thank you, Hillary. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and just ask questions.
I apologize. That's my son who's being taken into a different room, I think. You hear a crying baby.
No problem. Doug, did you have a question?
I have some, yes.
Okay, go for it.
I didn't want to hog the floor. Thank you, Hillary. It's that was an interesting run through, but I'm Doug. I'm with the Village of Plainfield, and I was curious. A couple of things that you touched on were essentially. Let's see. This is why I didn't go yet, Jennifer. I was trying to determine which one I was going to go with. Let's start with this. You mentioned that the West Branch model is still in development, and it is certainly going to have an impact on the overall development. Could you let me know what needs to happen up there and what kind of time frame we're looking at on that?
Yeah, so part of the reason that these weren't able to happen simultaneously is that we did have to wait for the data to end up in our hands from 2020, because that sampling did just finish not too long ago. So right now, I believe hydraulic calibration is complete, and we are moving into water quality and temperature. So, I mean, we're looking at just within hopefully a month or so. So relatively short time frame to get that complete, tying up some loose ends and running sensitivity. But we didn't want to wait until it was completely done to start on lower DuPage. So that's why they've been simultaneous. So not too far out.
Sure. You had a lot of information, and I know some of it running through years and who was being looked at in 2016 and 2018, 2020. I didn't know. I didn't take very good notes on all that, so I appreciate that. It's a couple months out. Sounds good.
Yeah.
I would like to think you're aware that the Hamel Woods Dam removal project is coming up here hopefully soon for us. And I was curious if you viewed that as an item that would necessitate a reevaluation on the hydraulic model, or how does that change our timing, or does it? Do you think you can account for that in the model?
Yeah, so right now the model is, it simulates the Hamel Woods Dam as a weir. And so we would, basically the plan is that every subsequent scenario that we will run will have that dam removed as like a first step, because we know that that's coming up soon. So that will be incorporated into everything moving forward.
And I was curious about, and I think it was your page 22. I don't know who has control of that. Is there, I assume that in what you've got to work with, you can blow up this section from May to September and see that a little bit more clearly. I would think that that would be the interesting part for comparison purposes as far as observed versus, because we don't have anything observed outside of that range. It's a little, for one, I'm old and my eyes have trouble with everything.
Yeah, and these colors aren't doing anybody any favors.
So I'm curious on all of that, and perhaps Jennifer and Tina might know. This is all, I assume, coming from the SONs that are out. It's our data.
Yeah, that's the continuous SON network that we maintain.
And that chart exists with us somewhere, meaning the scatter plot, the I'm
Yeah,
gonna-
we have all that data and we should have graphs of it for each year. And if, I don't know if Jennifer's had Alex do it, but all the DRSCW data gets plotted like yearly with the standard and all the standard. And so you can actually get a really good picture of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just on this, I can't tell. Generally speaking, it seems to capture a lot of it, and I get it day to night. It's gonna
Mhm.
peak and valley. That's hard for me to tell how well that's aligned. It's just a lot of stuff right in that.
Yeah,
one.
I mean, like she mentioned, it's getting a good picture of like the lows for the most part, but what it's not getting is this super saturation. So we just got to look at, there's a lot of things that affect that. So we just got to figure out what we're missing that's in for, I don't know what segment is this, Hillary?
This is reach 17, so it's like 2 reaches down from Hamel Woods.
Okay.
Yeah, and in the report that we'll be putting together as well to accompany this, we will, we can blow up certain areas. We'll make the graphics a bit easier to read. And we can also, can produce some statistics that kind of show how well we're capturing the DO in general at any given location.
And do these super saturations seem scientific? I
know. Yeah. I mean, for that section of river where it's shallow and not moving, it's looking like a lake. And this is very typical of what you see in like lake and impoundment conditions.
I again am ignorant of how much oxygen water can hold. I guess I never realized we could get up to the,
I'm actually surprised it's not lower. Usually when you see those high super saturations, during the day up into the 19s and 20s, you actually, you'll see the plummets down into, during when you see those highs, you'll see like those lows in zero, like down in the zeros. I looked at data from like Yorkville on the Fox where it goes from 24 to 0 during the day.
Yeah, and somewhere up in the 20s is typically where you're going to see it max out. I've never seen higher than in the 20s.
Yeah.
And it's a direct relationship to temperature. So the amount of DO that water can hold is going to vary throughout the time of year. And that's sort of represented by the pink here, the saturation point. That is what varies explicitly with temperature.
very good, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, if this is below the Hamel Woods Dam, we are actually in at least a better flowing area than that whole segment area upstream of the dam.
I'm just surprised that like
Yeah.
we're seeing like one day or something where it got super low. I'm just surprised.
Right.
I haven't really looked at this data too hard, but it's usually when you see these highs, you see those corresponding lows. And, we're technically, most of those days we were meeting the standards.
Yep, right.
And another thing that we are going to be using moving forward as well is in the reports, we're going to provide some documentation of, this is our understanding of, frequency of observed, exceedances of the standard in what locations, just because we want to make sure that, yes, we're looking at a single calendar year. So if this specific calendar year was a better year for DO, we want to make sure that we have that documentation included that's, part of this analysis that, well, this location though, maybe in previous years has been worse, and we'll keep that in mind as we develop scenarios too.
And my last question is really relative to the process overall and or how it is viewed by the EPA. I'm not sure how many of these are out in the nation and how much US EPA or Illinois EPA has seen these analyses. I'm curious if, and I don't know if this is appropriate for you, Hillary or Michelle, Jennifer, or John, or none of the above. How does the EPA take this, and what is their response? Or maybe the better question is, what's the most advanced model that you're aware of that's out there that has been defended with the EPA? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that the EPA definitely has familiarity with Qual2K and Qual2KW. I've personally used them on, dissolved oxygen TMDLs in different parts of the country as well. But I may push that question to John Butcher to see what he would say about that. John.
Hillary, you'll have to repeat the question for me because I didn't hear it all.
Yeah, so the question was about, how familiar is EPA with this kind of a model and their general acceptance of it, and are there more complex models that are used for this sort of thing even?
Well, so the Qual2K model is basically a rewrite and update of EPA's old Qual2E model, which was developed by EPA. This version was modernized by Steve Chapra and is quite commonly used in DOTMDLs, I think particularly in the Pacific Northwest. It's been used, I'm not sure if it's been used very much in Illinois, but Jennifer Olson can probably tell us that, but it is a well-accepted model. And there are, of course, more complicated models that also could be used, but mostly they get more complicated by adding, more dimensions, so different vertical layers and so on. Before a one-layer model, this model has all the processes that we need to simulate. And I think it will be found to be, familiar and acceptable by most EPA personnel.
Very good, thank you. That was it for me.
All right, does anybody else have any questions for Hillary? And, if things come up later, you can send me an email and we can get that out to Hillary and the others at Tetra Tech. Okay. Yeah, and those sort of some of the next things that we'll be working on are what the scenarios are that we'll want to run once the model is complete. And the idea with some of that is looking at, particularly in our areas where, like Dina mentioned, we have very slow moving, kind of wide and lake-like conditions. As we look at, potential restoration projects, like what are some of the things that we can do within that stream corridor to modulate flow and kind of diversify that. And so those might be some of the things that we'll look at as some of the model runs.
Yeah, and then, the big scenarios that'll be run through the model, we'll be looking at some of those, like we talked about at the wastewater treatment plant special condition holder meetings, is as our NIP, Nutrient Implementation Plan, language is specifically looking at targeting, reducing or getting rid of the DO impairments on the stream. We'll be looking at running our various phosphorus targets, the one, probably not the one, to see what impact phosphorus reduction has on DO. So that's our directive written out, spelled out very clearly for us in our permit language. So we'll be able to look at some projects, but we'll also be evaluating what impacts lower phosphorus limits have on DO impairments. In order to come up with that phosphorus target level as part of our NIP requirements.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Hillary, and others from Tetra Tech for putting this together.
Hand raised. Is that left over?
I think
it's
so.
left over.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure we weren't gonna miss her.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for having us today.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right. So one of the other pieces from our NIP process is looking at the non-point source side of nutrient inputs. So that's specifically kind of spelled out in looking at both point source and non-point source. So we've had this non-point source feasibility kind of analysis on our list of things to do for a while. The DRCW had been funding or helping to fund some studies that were going on up in Wisconsin, looking at leaf litter, and it is pretty much identified as one of the major sources of dissolved phosphorus from the non-point source side of things in urban areas. And so, really seeing the vast majority of that load coming from leaf litter in the kind of 2 months or so in the fall when leaves are falling off of trees and landing in the street. And so as it rains, the phosphorus is actually leached out of leaves very quickly. And so some of the work that was being done up in Wisconsin, and there's some additional work that's been done up in Minnesota, looking at by removing leaves from, particularly from the street, so what's sitting in the gutter on the street, how that impacts or reduces the amount of phosphorus getting into the storm sewer system. So there's been a lot of work looking at how leaves are collected. So both from the type of collection, whether they're bagged, whether they're raked to the backside of the curb and then collected, but then how street sweeping plays into that during that time period. And so one of the things that was really looked at was being able to prioritize areas that had more street trees and the amount of kind of that canopy over roadways, because that is obviously a direct correlation to the amount of leaves that are landing in the street, and then different levels of really targeting the removal of those leaves prior to rain events in the fall. So there's some really good information that's been put together, like I said, both through the USGS work that's been done in Wisconsin, as well as some other work that's been done up in Minnesota in the Twin Cities area, and some nice tools that are coming out of that to help prioritize that. If you only had so much money to put into a street sweeping program, how could you prioritize, where you did that so that you could get the most amount of reduction in that phosphorus load. So as kind of some of the steps in that process, we're going to be collecting information from all of the communities as well as the townships on what their current practices are with leaf collection. How much leaves are they collecting? Because we can kind of back into that, the potential reductions that we're already making through current practices between leaf collection and then street sweeping. And then once we have a better understanding of how all of our communities are doing that, we will also be able to potentially make some recommendations on ways that we could maybe maximize the removal of leaves. And, like again, if you only have so much time or money to put into street sweeping, where is that going to be most effective in your community to make the biggest reduction from a phosphorus standpoint? So that will help us be able to put together some of those recommendations. All of this still recognizing that the non-point source of phosphorus is very small in relationship to the wastewater treatment plants, but it is part of the requirement that we need to look at both sides of the point source and the non-point source. So we have a survey that DRCW has put together, and we're using that both in the upper parts of the watershed as well as in the main stem communities. For those communities who are kind of in both, like Naperville and Bolingbrook, you're only going to be required to collect or fill out the survey once. We're also going to be doing this survey in the lower Des Plaines. It'll be the same survey. It just has a separate data sheet. But again, for those communities too, I'll only be sending it. You only have to do it once. So those will be going out this week, and then I have it all set up for our communities, and then I'm reaching out to townships as well. It will go to our main contact for each of the communities, which in some cases is our treatment plant operator. I'm really going to need help from our community contacts to get it to the right person within your community to get it filled out. And we really are expecting to get this filled out by every community in the watershed so that we can build a complete picture on this. So I'll be reaching out directly to you, but then I'm going to need, your help in getting it to the right person within your community. And the better and more, complete and accurate that we can fill this out, the better recommendations we're going to be able to make as part of our NIP report, in 2023. So there's some pretty explicit directions about how to do this, like because you can save it as you go and be able to come back to it if you can't have it all completed at once, or if you need multiple people to be able to complete it. So Alex put together some good set of instructions, and then if you have any questions, there's contact information for Stephen or I as far as the survey or the what we're trying to get at with the survey questions. So like I said, again, it is a critical component of our nutrient implementation plan. We do need these from everybody. And I put kind of a target date on here. If we can get these completed by mid-June, that would be excellent. And we will definitely be tracking down and communities who haven't gotten it completed and make sure we get this information in. Permit renewals, we've kind of we have a few permits that have been kind of in a holding pattern because some language has been potentially changing slightly as far as extending out some of our permit conditions for DRCW. But I think we've gotten most of that, at least for the current permit renewals. I think we know where we're moving with those. We've had discussions with individual permittees on the current permit renewal process. We held a meeting with plant operators at the end of April to talk about kind of next steps in future permit conditions as related to what's going to be put in our nutrient implementation plan. So a lot of the discussion around the outputs or the benchmarks for total phosphorus that were in the IPS model and kind of what that might look like as it gets incorporated into the NIP. There'll be continued discussions on exactly how that translates to NIP recommendations. So the April 30th meeting was kind of I don't want to say the first we've been talking about this, but it really was an opportunity to get everybody in a room in person and be able to have some pretty good conversations around that. So we will be continuing those conversations directly with the treatment plant operators in the coming months and year as we get into 2023 for the final NIP. We've been talking about Hamel Woods for a long time. We're getting darn close. So right now, some discussions with Andy at the Forest Preserve this morning. Right now they're looking at the last week of June to start getting mobilized for this. So hopefully by mid-July, that dam will be removed and we will be able to update our picture here with really a new look to the river, with fish passage, removing safety hazards. This definitely is an exciting project. This is something I know that I've been in discussions with various Forest Preserve and DNR staff since I started with the Conservation Foundation back in 1998. So this is definitely going to be an exciting step forward, seeing this dam removed. And we will definitely be doing as much documentation of the removal process itself so that we can really be able to tell the story of this project. We had talked about seasonal outreach materials at our last season or our last meeting back in March. So those seasonal campaign materials are up. We have the now into summer materials. So the focus for summer has always been on kind of native vegetation, and we've expanded that into kind of some responsible river recreation. We obviously saw a big spike in using the river last year, and along with more people on the river came some challenges. as related to just people understanding the lack, obviously you might put in a park, but the river corridor itself is not all public property. There's a lot of private property that backs up to it, and just, being a river, responsible river recreator. So we have some blog materials and poster and other information on that to share with residents. We've been working on our garden refresh project here at the Conservation Foundation, and kind of sharing our journey into redoing one of our major garden beds around the house, it's a kind of very relatable project to homeowners. We've had a lot of excitement around that. And then continuing with our pet waste campaign. So yeah, our garden refresh project, I think we'll be planting it next Friday here, but we held a webinar at the end of March. We had nearly 500 participants on it, a lot of great questions, people really excited about learning how to do this at home. And like I said, our Cloud House garden is very relatable to the types of garden beds that residents have around their house. So I feel like this has been a great way to share the experience and kind of bring people along on a journey. So we'll be continuing to expand upon that throughout the entire summer and into the fall. Again, the River Responsible poster that we've put together, we'd definitely like to get that shared with your park districts. We have some blog posts, some of the social media pieces. So I think definitely some good things to share with folks throughout the summer. And again, we have the pet waste campaign. We still have some signs and pet waste bag dispensers. We've actually been working with some homeowners associations in the area to get the signs posted. It's really anybody who has a trail system. So like a subdivision that has a trail system, or working with our park districts, we'd really like to get more of these signs up. We have all the social media materials to go along with it, and blog posts. Leah's been sharing things all through the month of May. I think every Friday we have new social media stuff going up on the Facebook pages. So definitely like people to join in on that. And if you're interested still in getting signs or getting more signs, you can contact me on that. And again, Leah's been sharing a lot of our materials on Facebook really throughout the year. So it's a great way to have your community like the page. You can share things right from our page if that makes things easier. And I know Leah's been in contact with the communication folks from each of the communities to share this information as well. And the Conservation Foundation has continued to do its Conservation at Home webinars every Wednesday. We have all the webinars posted on our Conservation Foundation YouTube page. So these are great, if you're looking for something else to share with your residents. There's a whole variety of topics there that you can continue to look at and connect to and share with residents. So that was the end of the things I had on my list. If there are any other questions or comments that folks have, feel free to share those now. There we go. Yeah, that's why I kind of switched to this meeting format. So if people wanted to share anything or ask questions, pretty much just unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll be looking to get back together for our meeting in July, which will be on July 15th. And yeah, so if no other questions, if I can get a motion to adjourn the meeting. I got Joe with a motion and Scott with a second. And I assume everybody is in favor. So thank you for joining us today, and we will be back in touch with folks. Well, I'll be reaching out to our members with our leaf survey in the next day or so here, and then we'll we'll be back in touch for our meeting in July. Thank you, everybody.